you were going to go on the other side. Yeah.
Right now is our cross-examination portion of the afternoon, and Dinesh, your witness. You have 5 minutes.
Uh-oh.
Okay. You said that dark matter, dark energy, in fact, my understanding is that dark matter and dark energy together make up most of the matter, most of the energy in the universe,
It
correct?
appears to be so.
So if that is so, then it is the case that modern science, although it knows far more than it did in Newton's day, is also aware of how much it doesn't know. In fact, it could be that most of what is matter we know nothing about.
In fact, that's where the action is in science, where those gaps are.
Okay, so what we have here is a scientific knowledge that's advancing, but you might also say that the universe of the unknown is also advancing. So when you said earlier that, oh, they're just 2 small questions to be figured out, the truth of it is some very big questions, including the vast majority of stuff in this universe is actually not known. True?
Well, it's hard to say. There is, to quote our former Secretary of Defense, there is the known, and then there's the unknown.
Here's my point.
So how do you know when you don't know something?
Given this vast abyss of ignorance or lack of knowledge, not just about the supernatural, but about the natural, don't you think it's unbelievably arrogant that these new atheists like Hitchens, Dawkins, and these guys are going around saying there is no God? How could they possibly know?
They can't. Nobody knows.
So,
on the other hand, though, Dawkins' point is slightly more subtle than that. It's that we can have a probabilistic scale of likelihood in which you can say, on a scale of 1 to 7, I'm a 6 or a 5 that there is, or a 2 or a 1 that there isn't. But nobody really could be a 0 or an 8.
okay, well, let's look at the probability scale. Dawkins' argument, as you know, is mainly based on evolution, and evolution elucidates, correctly in my view, the transitions from life form A to life form B. Does evolution have an adequate account of the beginning of human life?
Human life, you mean?
I mean the first cell.
Any life.
The first cell, life.
The origins of life,
well,
science
yes or no will
that's
do.
not a Darwinian. The origins of life is a different field than evolutionary theory. So, yes, we have a half a dozen competing theories in science about the original origins of cells.
In your view, is there a theory good enough to be labeled science as to this is how we got the first cell?
Yes, because there are labs testing different hypotheses. For example, competing one between cells getting started on the surface of the ocean versus those deeper in the ocean versus the deep hot biosphere in the rocks. So you can run a lab experiment where you have a high pressure containment container and you put proteins in there and you compress them under high pressure and see if they bond.
So you're saying if a bunch of guys gets in a lab and you have intelligent scientists standing there and mixing proteins and setting high temperatures, this would actually show you how life began in the beginning, in the early stage of the Earth.
And I see where you're going with this.
Intelligent design, my friend. You're showing me intelligent design.
This would imply that an intelligent designer is just like us, but slightly smarter.
All right. I think you'd be better off confessing a little ignorance on this one, my friend. Okay, let's go on.
There's much we don't know.
Is it the case, when Dawkins is computing this probability, in your view, does he adequately address the argument that if you look at the various parameters and values of the universe, not moral values, I'm talking about the physical values, the mass of the proton as compared to the electron, the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, the electroweak force. Stephen Hawking, in The Brief History of Time, has the following line, which I might quote, and that is that he says, if you look at one of these parameters, he's just talking about the rate of expansion of the universe 1 second after the Big Bang. He says, if it had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before it reached its present size. In other words, if you change these parameters even a tiny bit, no universe, no life. What is the natural explanation for this?
Well, I'll just give you 2. One is multiple bubble universes.
Stop right there.
Yeah, I know.
Multiple bubble universes.
Maybe.
Stop. Is there any?
What does that mean?
Is there any empirical evidence for these?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
Okay. What's
That's
your
one
second explanation?
The second explanation I get from Stephen Weinberg, whom you quote in your book, and that is taking your own advice. We need to confess a reasonable amount of ignorance here about our understanding of the fundamental laws of nature. We do not have a theory of everything, a theory that ties, say, quantum mechanics with global general relativity. So until we do that, we can't say that all of these different configurations of the universe are a mystery to be solved with 6 different explanations. There might just be one single equation, the proverbial equation on the t-shirt that explains all of those, and we don't know what that is yet.
But even if we did, I think, Michael, you're just assuming that that would be, let's say we discovered one superforce that generated 100 other values in the universe. Wouldn't that have to be accounted for? In other words, I'm making this point, that isn't it true that if we look at nature, we find enormous intelligence embodied in the laws of nature? In fact, all our best scientists, from Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Einstein, spend their whole lifetime decoding the intelligence out of nature, right? Newton's inverse square law, E equals mc squared. So all I'm saying is, if all our scientists are spending their brain power decoding the intelligence out of nature, who put it in there? What's your answer to that?
I think using the word intelligence is, that's anthropomorphizing nature.
Lawfulness.
Lawfulness, or the consistency of it, simply because we can experiment with it and see it repeating over and over, so there's a consistency to it. The fact that that's the case, and what its ultimate source is, well, as I said, we don't know yet, other than that's the way the universe is. Maybe there's lots of bubble universes, maybe there's some other underlying principle. Look, physics is only a couple hundred years old in terms of sort of modern physics, so how can we say we know enough to know that there's a mystery that requires a supernatural intervention?
So isn't here the real difference, and I end on this final question, isn't the real difference between you and me the following? I say that there are these 100 parameters at the beginning. You say, gee, that's interesting, and let's leave it at that. Maybe one day we'll find a natural explanation. I want to call this the atheism of the gaps. In other words, we have no explanation, but maybe there'll be one, and in the meantime, we should all trust you, and that something will be forthcoming. Why isn't using the logic of Occam's razor? We see intelligent design, and absent an alternative explanation. Now, when it comes to human life, I'll accept the Darwinian view, but no one claims that the parameters of the universe, that's an argument immune to Darwinian refutation. So isn't it the case that Occam's razor dictates that if you see intelligence at that level, it's reasonable to posit an intelligent designer?
It would be if it weren't for the fact that we've had such a long experience in the history of science of us always impugning an intelligent agency to nature and typically always being wrong about it. Lightning, the weather, and so forth. It's natural for us to impugn agency. We may even have an agency module in our brain that just
So your
does
argument
this.
is not science,
So
it's history. You're reading history to say that the lesson of history, based on Copernicus and the ancient animists who thought that there were spirits
Yes,
in the canal.
We should be cautious, right.
We should be cautious,
Our
and
skeptical alarms should be going off whenever we think we've discovered something new that makes us special. In fact, the universe is actually not all that intelligently designed. For 99.9% of the history, 14 billion year history of the universe, it wasn't well designed for life to start. In fact, most places, most stars and planets you go to, they're not in the least bit well designed for life to begin. It can only happen in a tiny handful of places. Therefore,
Let's switch the tables.
Okay.
You're on.
Well, he's been using up his time.
and we will settle all this later over adult beverages, which is the only way to handle these ultimately. The big questions. Dinesh, where do you get your morals from? That is from God, revelation, prayer, voices, your parents, your upbringing, culture, the Bible.
I think that our morals are the product, I would say they come from 3 sources. One is human nature. And by human nature, I mean we have what Adam Smith called, well, you know this, the impartial spectator, the little umpire inside of us. And it seems that we can't be human without having something like that. We also get our morals from our parents, from our religious faith, from our culture and tradition, and from experience. So those are the diverse sources of morality.
So, okay, I'll agree on certainly so basically nature, nurture. Our nature, we have some sort of deep umpire, a little homunculus in there telling us what's right and wrong, the sense of guilt or shame or pride or joy. why can't God have simply used evolution as the means of creating these moral senses, just like you would already agree that God used evolution, or evolution accounts for the origins of, say, primates into humans? You conceded that point.
I am actually open to that possibility. I would argue that the evolutionary attempt to explain morality has made a little headway, but only a little. It accounts for what you could call low altruism. In other words, yeah, the mom jumps into the burning car to save her 2 kids because she has genes in common with them, or we have some sort of tit-for-tat reciprocity rules. I understand all that. I've read The Selfish Gene. But I don't think that this explains 90% of morality. First of all, altruism isn't the beginning and end of morality. There's justice. I mean, if you look, for example, at many of the 10 Commandments, you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, you shouldn't steal. Machiavelli says you should. You just shouldn't get caught. And you should develop a powerful reputation as an honest man so that you can steal more. Now, along come these evolutionary guys, and they give you some ridiculous explanations for, well, gee, but you need to develop an honest reputation, because you have to be really honest, because otherwise your reputation is worthless, and so on. Machiavelli's point is, no, if you are an honest man, you will come to grief. If you are a dishonest man who is known as an honest man, that's going to get you ahead in life.
But if these deep moral sentiments are there, and what I'm arguing is, so you read The Selfish Gene, you need to read Why Darwin Matters, Chapter 7, why Christians and conservatives should accept Darwin, because it does explain the fact that it's not enough to pretend being a moral person, to fake it, to do the calculation. You actually need to believe it and live it, because that's the only way to convince others that you are a group member, and a reliable group member, and therefore, over the eons, we evolve these true deep moral sentiments, in the same way that you and I would. But on the other hand, if you're at some point positing a divine, supernatural intervention to give us these moral sense, do those moral principles exist outside of God? If there were no God, would they still be out there in a Platonic sense, or do they depend on God's existence and God is part and parcel of those principles? And if so, why the dastardly things that he did in the Old Testament if he was moral?
Well,
or she?
I think that when you look at the structure of morality, you see a lot that can't be given an easy Darwinian explanation. Even Dawkins admits that something so simple as getting up and giving a woman a seat in the bus. Now you could, I guess, say, well, yeah, but you're only doing that because next week you want her seat. But no, you probably are doing it because you're a nice guy. Or why you give blood. Or why you say, give me liberty or give me death. Or Mother Teresa. I mean, you have a lot of morality that doesn't fit the Procrustean bed of Darwinian explanation, in my view. The good thing to be said for Darwinism, I think, is that, like Christianity, it has a low or realistic view of human nature. In this sense, it is very different than what I want to call liberal morality. Liberal morality is you should give people freedom, because if you do, they will use it wonderfully. I agree with Immanuel Kant, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. So in that sense, I appreciate the realism of Darwinian understandings.
Okay, my last question. Since there seems to be very little agreement amongst religious people about how to interpret Holy Scripture as a source of biblical or a source of moral principles, you wrote a book called What's So Great About America. Isn't what's so great about America the fact that it doesn't require a religious test? It doesn't matter which religion you are. We've come to agreement on a set of principles. These are the rules we're going to live by, and you have to abide by them regardless of which religion you are, or even if you're not religious in the least.
Well, to some degree that's true, but my argument earlier was that if you look at the core institutions of America, by the way, including the institution of separating church and government, we think, hey, that's an American invention, and America did advance the principle. But no, I mean, even in the Bible, Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, to God what is God's. I mean, even in the heyday of the Spanish Inquisition, of the kings of the medieval kingdoms and so on, you had a separation between the church and the state, which you didn't have, for example, in Islam. So all I'm saying is a little bit of atheist appreciation for what Christianity has done to build our society. seems to me to be long overdue and probably the ground of rapprochement between the believer and the unbeliever.
Rapprochement would be a good idea. Bill?
Okay, now it's time for our questions. We have microphones right here and right there. You can get up. Now remember, I have 4 boys, so I'm good at cutting people down. No speeches, just a question, because we want to get as many as we can in. Why don't we go here first?
Am I live here? Okay. My question is for Mr. D'Souza. It's going to sound like a smart-ass question, but I really don't mean it that way. What do you think God has against amputees anyway?
What does God have against amputees?
Yeah, why don't people that believe in divine intervention test it in a situation where the results would be unambiguous, like an amputee? You don't ever hear about that.
Well, you're asking, and so initially I thought you were being silly, but you're asking a very profound question about the nature of miracles. And let me answer it this way. The argument of the Christian, well, first of all, I do reject the Stephen Jay Gould idea that religion and science are in totally separate domains. In some senses, they do have an overlapping area, and miracles is a good example of that. If I were to say to you, I didn't have an arm yesterday and today I do, that's completely empirically verifiable. We can bring in the doctor, we can bring in the yardstick, we can measure my arm. So in that sense, I argue that any miracle should be judged by the standards of modern science. By the way, the Catholic Church agrees with you. If someone claims a miracle, their idea is not to say, oh, hallelujah. It is to say, bring in the doctors, bring in the scientists, bring in the devil's advocate, and let's test this out. But here's the point I want to make about miracles. There is a categorical difference between claims of miracles, which are in the empirical domain, and a whole set of other questions equally vital for our everyday life, but that lie outside the domain of experience. If I were to say to you, is there an afterlife? That is a question of a different kind. You could say, well, I don't believe in it because where's the evidence for it? I would say to you, what kind of evidence are you looking for? Are you waiting for dead people to come back to life and testify in court? That's not going to happen. So if you say, I don't know, and therefore I don't believe, and I say, I don't know, and yet I believe, what we have in common is we both don't know. The only difference is, I admit it. I admit that my belief in an afterlife is based on faith, whereas you erroneously think that your rejection of the afterlife is the triumph of reason. It's not. It too is a leap in the dark. It too is a position taken on faith. So I would distinguish between miracles on the one hand and claims about the afterlife, the soul, and God, where I think both the atheist and the believer is to some degree taking a step in the dark.
Let me just follow up real quick. You believe God heals.
Sure.
So why, to get to his question, so why doesn't
Oh,
he
right.
heal amputees?
Oh, this is a good question. Okay, I'll answer the question. I think I was trying to get a little deeper than the question, but I'll rise to the level of the question. Look, I'll answer it. Miracles can happen in two ways. One way is in the way of God uses a non-natural source to produce something that could not have occurred naturally. The other is, there is something that would not have happened if natural forces were left to their own devices, but the supernatural intervention is simply to use natural means to bring about a result that wouldn't otherwise have occurred. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, we're saying that when the Israelites were leaving Egypt, they were pursued by the Egyptians and a storm came that then killed all the Egyptians. You could say, well, why did God need a storm? He could basically have come down from heaven himself and killed them one by one, but the natural device of the storm may have had a supernatural instigation. You have no way of knowing whether it did or not any more than I do. So here we are in the province of faith, but all I'm trying to say is the belief that there is a supernatural agency is no more irrational than your insistence that there isn't. What am I talking about? I answered his question.
All right, hang on. We're having a civil debate.
I think I did.
We'll take the questions, and we don't need the audience participation, except for class.
I have a question for both of you. In a world of rapidly diminishing resources, why should we continue to consider all human life equally precious?
Well, because God told me so. According to PETA, no. And that pretty much covers the extremes. Well, obviously, as a culture, we've decided that we've made certain decisions about what constitutes the most valuable forms of life, and we have a pecking order, and everybody pretty much knows what that is, and that's the whole point of the animal rights movement, I guess, is to change that configuration. But what you're really getting at is what's the ultimate origins for things like all people have value in and of themselves. And I think that's one of those nobody knows. I mean, you can say, well, God said so. How do you know? Because you read it in a holy book, and not everybody agrees on that because God told you so. It's a sense that you just feel. Or is it that we've just decided as a group, these are the things we value? And so I think one of the valuable aspects of Christianity is that it's gone through an enlightenment, not just an enlightenment, the enlightenment, part of which was that human life has value in and of itself, not as a tool towards something, but just because it is, just because we've said so. And that's one of the things I think that Islam has not gone through in enlightenment. And so I'd say it comes from us just deciding that.
Dinesh, quick
Michael, I'm really glad you're not a historian, because this would send you into the F zone here. No, the Enlightenment had no such principle. In fact, its principles were very different. Consider Jefferson, who is a very representative figure of the Enlightenment. All Jefferson's egalitarian beliefs, by his own admission, came from Christianity. On the other hand, all his beliefs that blacks were inferior to whites came from science. He was a man of his time. He drew his racial views about the inferiority of blacks from the best science of his day. And so we get here to a very interesting question. The question is basically, why is human life valuable? It's a little difficult to say, and you know why? Because the principle really is theological. It's difficult to say in a natural way. So if I were to say to this gentleman, human life isn't all that valuable, the world would be better off if from this large audience, one person was executed, and can we have you as a volunteer? He would immediately come back, well, but I have 7 degrees. My life is really valuable, but there might be some other guys whose life is less valuable. And here we get Nietzsche's prophecy. Nietzsche's prophecy is when you get rid of God, then the principles brought into the world by Christianity begin to fray. And sure enough, we're seeing evidence of that at this debate itself.
I wonder if you could talk more about the role of religion in the 2008 election. Michael, you said twice that we don't have a religious test for president, but I wonder if that's true. Can a non-Christian get elected to be president of this country in this day and age? And why did Romney have to give that speech?
Well, legally, there's no religious test, of course. Culturally, obviously, there still is, and that's why I gave the speech. Although it's not happened in terms of the presidency, probably, although it's questionable about how religious Lincoln was, or even Reagan to that extent. And of course, because everybody knows what the cultural pressures are, they always say that they are. And but we know not all congressmen are religious. Some are self-professed atheists, although they don't make a big deal about it. Again, because there's nothing to make a big deal about. It's just something you don't happen to believe. It's not a platform you build on. So I think, being optimistic, I'd say it's possible, although not very likely. That last poll I saw was that if X were qualified to be president, and X were, I think it was black, Jewish woman, gay, atheist, I think you could be a black, Jewish woman, gay president before you could be an atheist president. So we're sort of the last of the oppressed minorities or whatever. I mean, I don't personally feel oppressed like that.
This expression of victimhood
I live in LA,
is very touching.
But the problem is I'm encouraging, I guess in the long run, in the last 500 years, more people in more places have more liberties than ever. And we treat with respect more and more people of diversity than ever. And so although there's, like the global warming curve, it goes up and down, there's lots of downs recently, I think the overall trend is positive toward the treatment of all people as members of the same in-group rather than the in-group, out-group that we've always had.
You know, we've been talking about religion and politics, and there's a lot of abuse on all sides. I mean, even on the Democratic side now, you have candidates carrying Bibles bigger than my arm. A sort of, you can call it tactical Christianity. But look, you have to realize that the atheists shouldn't be sobbing too much about all this because, you know, atheism is very powerful in influential sectors of the media, the universities. Here you have Hitchens going around saying religion poisons everything. Anyone with a modicum of common sense would say to him, how can you speak such nonsense? Poisons everything? Did religion poison Shakespeare and Bach and Dante and Milton and Raphael and Michelangelo? A good deal of the literature and culture and music and art of Western civilization is inspired by Christianity. How is it even the beginning of intellectual honesty to say something so ridiculous? But no one even challenged him. All you saw is Chris Matthews and Tim Russert and you know, fawning before this. So, and then in the universities, I think it's even worse. I just want to read you, if I may, a one-line quote from Richard Rorty, the philosopher. He basically says, we in the university secular professors should, quote, arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views more like our own. He says, under the control of people like me, we want you to escape the grip of your frightening, vicious, dangerous parents. We are going to try to discredit you in the eyes of your children, try to strip your religious community of dignity, try to make your views seem silly rather than discussable. So we're not seeing here a live and let live. We're seeing a kind of, you can call it evangelical atheism that is trying very hard to go after young people by equating, I think, through pure sophistry, enlightenment with atheism and science with atheism. I think ultimately it's besmirching the good name both of enlightenment and of science.
Gentlemen, I submit my question to both of you here. This seems to be an argument, not just here, but in terms of the so-called bright argument dealing with the new atheism. This seems to be an argument gravitating around the idea that the cause, religion, has corrupted the effect, which is the people. My question is, and I came from a writer that I really appreciate, Antony Flew, who says to equate the poisons of humanity with religion is like equating nuclear proliferation with Einstein's theory of relativity. Could you please elaborate on that?
Whoa. I guess it's. We've been discussing two different things here today. You know, the sort of central tenets of religion, are they true or not, and then whether they're true or not, the effects of believing in them. So to that extent, I guess I'd say I believe in the gods that live inside people's heads that they believe. I believe that they believe and that they act on those beliefs. That is certainly true and measurable and obvious. And so I guess my answer would be you have to separate those, and it is ridiculous to just say is religion good or bad. I mean, what parts of it? It's good when it does good and so forth. So it just depends on the very specific claims that are made.
I think that it's too easy just to say that this is all just a malady in human nature. I think you have to ask this question, and many historians and philosophers have asked it in looking at the crimes, for example, of communism in the last century, which is, how could so much blood be spilled? These were supposed to be scientific and empirical theories. How could so much blood be spilled in the name of this kind of a utopia? If you read Richard Weikart's book, From Darwin to Hitler, you see that Hitler, while in his first couple of years trying to get to power, invented what he called the Aryan Christ to appeal to the Bavarian Catholics and the Lutheran Protestants. That failed, and then Hitler set out in a very determined way to destroy Christianity. Hitler and the Nazis were really inspired by two main sources. The first was Darwinism and social Darwinism, the idea of survival of the fittest. And the other was the Nietzschean idea of the will to power. In fact, those two phrases occur and reoccur many times in Nazi recruitment propaganda. The other point, I think, is that Dostoevsky, I think, gets to the root of it in The Brothers Karamazov, where he says, if God is not, everything is permitted. I do not agree with Michael that Torquemada, if he had a nuclear bomb, would have used it. And why? Because Torquemada, vicious man though he was, power-hungry though he may have been, his goal was not to exterminate the earth. His goal was not to wipe out. His goal ultimately was a religious one. He was a believer, scary though that thought may seem. And so he, vicious though he may have been, had to consider the possibility of a last judgment. Dostoevsky's point is, you remove moral accountability, you remove the last judgment, and then it comes down completely to the will to power. And then these guys say, well, if I'm in power and I can kill 5 million people, and I want to, what's to stop me?
Thank you. So, Mr. D'Souza, in 1947, Justice Hugo Black used Thomas Jefferson's metaphor in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Church, the separation, or the wall separating church and state. Justice Black was a former Ku Klux Klansman, hated the Catholic Church because of their charity. There seems to have been something that happened at that time in 1947 that that has grown stronger as time has gone by, in that the metaphor, what Jefferson meant as a metaphor. And I wonder if you could comment on that as to what has resulted from that.
You're onto something with the history. There is actually a kind of ugly anti-Catholicism behind the early move to establish separationism as a doctrine. Philip Hamburger's book on this subject is quite good, but I'm going to skip over that. I want to make a little different point, and that is, what in a pluralistic society is true fairness? Let's say that we have a public square. It seems to me that basically what the ACLU is saying and what some of the new atheists are saying is, here's how we keep this public square neutral. We identify all the religious attitudes and beliefs, we kick them out. We keep only secular and atheist and unbelieving points of view in the public square, and now we have been marvelously fair to everybody. So, if someone says, I want to put a statue of Moses in the public square, nonsense. Why not? Well, because there may be a hypothetical Hindu who objects to Moses. He's upset. Well, Lord, let's say somebody else says, I want to put a statue of Voltaire in the public square. Well, 25,000 people may object, but it's like, who cares what you think? Go write a letter to the editor. You're making a secular objection. It has no constitutional weight. So we have a double standard here. And all I'm saying is, instead of this rigid separationism, which I think is unfair to religious believers of all stripes, what we need is pluralism, which is to say some way of determining equal access or fair access to the public square so religious and non-religious viewpoints can coexist with toleration.
But there is no atheist statue somebody would put up. I mean, it isn't a
Why
thing.
not?
Secular is just without religion. Atheism is without theism. And that's all it is. So if you were to erect a statue of say, George Washington, it would not be because he's a believer or a non-believer. It's because, well, this is public ground, and he was a public figure doing a public thing, and that's what we're honoring him for.
Well, but let's
in a
say you
public
want.
ground.
Let's say, Michael, you propose. I don't think you'd propose this, but let's say you propose a statue to Richard Dawkins in the public square. Could I object to that on religious grounds, and would my religious grounds count as a constitutionally valid objection to Dawkins?
If it was because he was an atheist, then yes.
So we'd have to first determine the reason.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if I put a statue of Moses and I say it has nothing to do with the fact that he was Jewish, it simply is that the Ten Commandments have had a powerful historical influence on Western society, it's okay by you?
Maybe.
Okay.
Wow.
It depends
Okay.
on what was really
Fair.
going on.
This side?
Well, I have several comments and questions as well. When you talked about religion, force good or evil, are you talking about religions or Christianity? That's number one. I want to be clear about this. And as we know, that Christianity, or at least was one God, telling us the knowledge of good and evil. So the good and evil is a knowledge, and the person is evil or the person is good. You are not talking the people who are good and bad, not the good and bad as a thing. That's number one. Number two, you mentioned something very interesting. You said you were born again. I'm sorry, I'm not making this to be sarcastic. Born again Christian and we're evangelist. How can you be unborn and become another evangelist for something you don't trust in. I want to explain this. You failed in that one. Are you going to tell us something that we don't even believe in? I would like explanation for
There's
that.
still hope for my soul. Well, it was a little bit of tongue in cheek there. I mean, when you become a non-believer, there's actually really nothing to do. I mean, when I decided that Oswald probably did act alone, I became an JFK conspiratist, I guess, or something. There's nothing to do about it. It's just that religion is so important in our culture. Where you land on that particular claim seems to be more important to other people than like whether you believe in Bigfoot or not. So to that extent, and it wasn't even a big deal at the time. It was only when I started writing books and it seemed like it came up a lot. And in the late 90s, it's like the question everybody always asks. So in America, religion is just, I can't seem to get away from the subject. It's just so important to so many people that it comes up like that. But no, I mean, there was nothing for me to actually do with that.
Is it possible that you jumped before you crawled? Because did you read the whole Bible? Do you understand?
Did I make a mistake when well, I really did believe. I mean, I did. I was genuine
because
about
the
it.
spiritual thing of God is discerned spiritually.
Well, I'm hoping that I'll still be in there.
Okay.
Because I really did once believe.
I think there's hope.
Well, I think Michael's explained to me why Europe's population is shrinking. When you're an unbeliever, you have nothing to do. But look, I want to make this point. You asked about religion or Christianity, and you know, my work has been focused on Christianity. I've written politically about Islam. So why did we say in this debate, is religion a force for good or evil and not just Christianity? The answer is I kind of wanted to give Shermer a bit of a chance.
No, it'd have been easier the other way.
All right, we're running a little bit over time,
all
so we
right,
want
we
to get
can
to as many questions as we can. So let's
Okay, I'll try to be
keep
quick
it short
here.
on both sides.
Ed Hudgens from the Atlas Society. Dinesh, by the way, I privatized the public square. My question concerns natural law. Cicero, before Jesus, wrote that there's not one law at Rome and another at Athens, but a law for all people and at all times. This is right reason in accordance with nature. This notion comes pre-Christian from, in this case, a Roman philosopher. My question is this: why can I not observe, number one, that I am a self-conscious creature? I can think about the fact that I'm thinking. Yep. Number two, that I have a rational capacity, our unique form of knowing the world around us. Number three, that the universe is ordered. I observe that. After all, if it weren't ordered, we wouldn't be here. Number four, that reason and a skeptical approach is how we determine how to survive and prosper and flourish. Why do I need, with that worldview, to put in some supernatural notion or some superstition or something concerning if I talk to a piece of bread, it'll become flesh and then I'm supposed to chew on it, or God lives on the planet Kolob? Or why do I have to add anything like that rather than this approach that I've just given you, which I think you agree with a lot of the particulars? Why do I need something supernatural to add to it?
Well, I agree with all the particulars, and was kind of riding along with you in your car before you went straight into the brick wall. And that's this, Ed. I mean, you and I have come out of the political world, and we are empirical by temperament. And I would agree that to do a lot of the empirical work we do in the world, you don't need it. But Wittgenstein once said, even if all possible scientific questions are resolved, the main or the biggest questions, I'm paraphrasing, of life would go largely untouched. What does he mean by this? What he really means is that you can't be human without, in a profound sense, wondering about...
All men by nature desire to know, Aristotle.
You have a universe. Why are we here? Why is that universe even here? Even Stephen Hawking, as a skeptic, says, who put the fire into those equations? Now, why is this important? It's not just idle curiosity. It is that if these things are true, a lot of things follow. For example, if there's an afterlife, it would change the way we live now. It's not just about the next world. In fact, you've seen the movie about the woman who discovers, she has cancer. I've only got 2 weeks to live. She changes her whole life. If you discovered, Ed, tomorrow that you have 500 more years to live, you would live your life differently. So my point is, these are not idle abstractions. They are questions of direct import. Now here's the key point, if I may, very briefly. On a lot of these questions, full empirical information will never be available. It's like if I'm dating a girl for 10 years, I now have to decide if I want to propose. I can say, you know what, I really don't know what life is going to be like with her for the next 50 years. I'm going to be an agnostic and await the data. Well, you're never going to know. If you stay that way, she'll marry someone else or you'll both be dead. So this is where I invoke Pascal's wager. There are times in life where we have to make a decision even though we don't know for sure.
I'm glad the short answers and short questions, they're really sticking to that. Great.
I was wondering what methods you use for determining the credibility of whatever sources you're reading, such as how do you know that the copy of the Bible that you're reading wasn't rewritten to make God and all the angels white or to serve somebody else's purpose? Or would you believe that Adolf Hitler was a Catholic just because Richard Dawkins says so? But what methods do you use to judge if whatever information you're reading has any credibility?
Well, I think on those two questions, you would use methods of historical reliability. For example, it's pretty clear Hitler was born Catholic in the same way that Mao was born a Buddhist and Stalin was born into the Russian Orthodox Church. There's very strong empirical evidence that all three men vehemently rejected their religious upbringing. If you read a book called Hitler's Table Talk, a collection of Hitler's statements assembled over many years by his own close aides, they show you Hitler's private opinions about Christianity and about God. It's very clear. On the issue of the Bible and Jesus and so on, you've got to use a fair standard here because we're talking about ancient history. What is the evidence, for example, that Socrates existed? We have only two sources. We have Plato, we have Xenophon. The truth of it is, virtually no serious historian denies that Socrates was a real guy, based upon two guys who said so. Moreover, those ancient manuscripts were lost for centuries. How do we know Alexander the Great existed? We have very little evidence, and the evidence is old. With the Bible, not only do you have the four Gospels, not only do you have the Acts, all written, by the way, in the 1st century of Christ's death. Second, you have Roman historians, you have Jewish sources like Josephus, you have Tacitus, you have Suetonius, you have multiple sources, hostile sources. Then you have Christians who said that Christ was resurrected. The Romans said, if you say that, we'll kill you. Many people went to their deaths insisting it was so, even though they had every reason to get out of it by saying, even if it did happen, to say it didn't happen. But they wouldn't. So what I'm saying is, if you approach this historical information objectively, you'll see there is far more evidence for the reliability of the Bible than for almost any ancient source going back that far. There are multiple manuscripts from multiple sources. There's a whole school that studies all this to establish reliability. Monks copied those manuscripts, but when you have 500 of them, you can compare to see where the copying errors may have come in. This is a whole science. Bottom line, guys like Dawkins and Hitchens and so on are smart, I grant you. But they are smart within their own fields. When they walk outside of their fields, they become incredible ignoramuses. They know very little about theology, very little about history, and this is the intellectual embarrassment of the new atheism.
Now, Dinesh, the first page of the Book of Mormon is an affidavit of the disciples of Joseph Smith who said they saw the gold tablets. Why don't you believe that the angel Moroni dictated on gold tablets in reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics the story of how the lost tribe of Israel came to America and ended up in Palmyra, New York, in which these gold tablets were buried, and Joseph Smith put his head in the hat with the gold in the little tablets so he could read? You don't believe any of that, and yet it's only a couple hundred years old, and we have the testament. We have a testament of the people who saw it.
We can debate about. I know the Mormons call them the Latter-day Saints, and so. In all honesty, I think it's fair to say, and I think Bill here, our moderator, may step in, simply to note that the Mormons are not considered by most people to be within the ambit of mainstream or traditional Christianity.
They do.
In fact, no, of course they do, but of
we
course
may have a president.
Look, No. In fact, you're missing the significance of evangelical Christian support for Romney, because the significance of it is that evangelical Christians are learning to distinguish between theology and political morality. Evangelical Christians greatly fear and detest Mormonism as a theology. On the other hand, they may say, politically, we still agree with Romney.
But on the historical question, why would you accept 2,000-year-old sources and not 200-year-old sources?
Well, first of all, the 200-year-old source is simply one guy.
No, you got the disciples. They all signed it. The first page is an affidavit. We saw the gold tablets ourselves. We heard the revelation.
Let's make 2 points here. I wasn't trying to establish that if you read the Bible, you should immediately accept that it is God's word as handed down. I was answering his point. How do you know there's historical reliability? And I was employing completely secular canons of evidence to establish that. Whether or not you believe Jesus when he says he's the Son of God, that's a theological point. Whether you believe the Trinity, that's up to you. The reliability of the Bible as being a document produced by the first century Christians to describe the life of Christ, I think on that we are on pretty firm ground. Christopher Hitchens says, I don't even know if Christ was a historical figure. Here he would find 95% or more of professional historians disagreeing with him. The historicity of Christ is pretty well established.
Okay, Mr. D'Souza, you see evolution as directed by God and to produce, basically to produce us, essentially as beings in his image. And I mean as conscious beings. How do you explain the chaos of mass extinctions that took place many times in evolutionary history?
Well, first of all, I don't recall making the argument you attribute to me. I said that if you look at the design of the universe, that you see in it the signature of a designer. Look, on evolution, my view is this, and that is that evolution gives a good account of how we go from one life form to another. I don't agree with the so-called intelligent design guys who say that there is no evolutionary explanation for the human eye or for the fact that, that you cannot account for evolution between from one species to another. I don't agree with that, but I think one reason that people have become so skeptical about all this is that if you open up the textbooks, you will see that there are a number of people who make a jump from what can be called biological evolution to what can be called metaphysical Darwinism. In other words, they use evolution to try to prove atheism. And moreover, when you're talking about guys like Dennett and Dawkins, they think that evolution explains everything. If you say to them something like, why do children not like to eat vegetables? Well, we've got an evolutionary answer for that one. Why do men not like to ask for directions? We figure out that one on the evolutionary basis too. I'm a little suspicious when evolution begins to march so promiscuously and try to explain things that have alternative and better explanations.
My real question is, if this is reflective of God designing the thing, which I think you do, you have said in your book that you believe that God is behind it all, after all, where do mass extinctions come in? They're very chaotic. They wipe out, Permian mass extinction wiped out 90% of the life on Earth as far as we know.
Because it may well be that God devised a lawful universe, and that's the universe we have. My point here is you're not disputing the existence of God. You may say that God was a bit of a meanie, because after all, we don't have the dinosaurs still prancing around among us. And you're free to take that view, but theologically I would consider it shallow. It has nothing to do with science.
Okay. Yes, this question is for Dinas. Richard Poirier speaking. I think there's a lot of problems with your argument. If we look at modernity, one of the major problems is that there's no general consensus on what constitutes the good. There tends to be no rational grounding for morality. When we look at the approaches that different religions have taken, all modern religions seem to incorporate concepts of ministering or advocating their particular point of view and also bringing other people into their fold, and that easily transgresses into coercion. And that, I think, is one of the problems that we're seeing with modern problems in the Middle East.
Question.
Okay, so the question is, What do you feel that religion or God is bringing to the table with respect to providing a grounding for morality?
Well, according to you, once you accept the desirability of religious proselytization, it follows almost inexorably that some element of coercion will be involved. I want to suggest that the greatest examples of coercion in our time have nothing to do with religion. In fact, religious regimes, even at their worst, let's take the radical Muslims, they're pretty bad. But even in Islam, the basic idea is that you're free to convert in, even though you're not free to convert out. Now compare this very repressive principle in Islam with the principle, for example, under communist regimes. You're not free to convert in, you're not free to convert out, you're not free to leave the country, you're not free to have you think what you do in your own thoughts. Your children are encouraged to inform on you. So what I'm saying is, how can somebody in the 21st century look at religion and say that in the grand scheme of things, with all the ideologies we have out there, that religion, and then Christianity from the Garden of Eden, has postulated the principle of choice. Not always respected in Christian history, but today, Christianity, I would say, is strongly committed. Even the Pope endorsing the idea there should be freedom to get in, there's freedom to get out, and even if you go to the most right-wing evangelical Promise Keepers rally, you'll meet some big hairy guy who will embrace you and say, let me tell you what Jesus Christ has done in my life. He doesn't say, you know what, I've got a small dagger in my coat, and if you don't accept Christ, I'll plunge it into your chest. So my point is, what are you afraid of?
Well, I'm particularly afraid...
That's a rhetorical question.
Very good, Bill.
I'm sorry, but we only have time for 2 more questions, so we'll take one from this line, one from that line. I'm sorry, everybody. Go ahead.
Dinesh, my greatest objection with organized Christianity is the doctrine of eternal judgment and the implication that this has on the character of God himself. Can I read a quote from Robert Ingersoll? Eternal judgment must be eternal cruelty. I do not see how any man, unless he has the brain of an idiot or the heart of a wild beast, can believe in eternal judgment. Now, most Christian teachings are reasonable.
Okay, question. You need a question here.
The question is, why should I lower myself to accept a morality that is something less than what I believe already? None of us here would consider eternal judgment to be fair, just, or why should I accept such a morality?
Sherma, you want to take that one? No. Look. The concept of eternal judgment, the idea of eternal in Christianity, true, some people read it as it lasts forever, it never stops, and so on. Part of eternal judgment is also judgment outside of space and time. That's the true meaning of eternal in the Christian tradition. Now, here's what I want to get at. Christopher Hitchens, in one of his articles, makes this point. He says, I don't want to go to heaven. He says, it sounds like a terrible place. It sounds to me like celestial North Korea. You've got a big dictator over there. He goes, all that we have is a simple job, hand out garlands. He goes, I don't want to hand out garlands. He goes, the worst thing about celestial North Korea is, at least in the real North Korea, you die. Now, here's what I want to get at. Sherma thinks I'm making his case, so he's getting excited. But here's the point I want to make, and that is this. You know, the Bible says salvation is the gift of God. And many people interpret this to say, God is giving us the gift of salvation. No. The Bible isn't saying salvation is the gift from God. It is the gift of God. God is the gift. Here's the point. What you're calling eternal judgment, eternal salvation is simply this. It is the decision of the believer who wants to receive God. Now, Hitchens doesn't want to receive God. It's not that God is grabbing him and flinging him into hell. No. Hitchens is cutting himself off from God by free, voluntary choice, and God is reluctantly acquiescing in his free decision. It's a libertarian choice by a libertarian guy. So that's the point ultimately, It is that those people who don't want God won't get him, and those people who do will.
The last question.
Hi, this is for Mr. D'Souza. First, you're a brave guy for coming here and addressing this crowd today, so thanks. But my question is regarding something you said in your opening statement, that essentially compassion was brought into the world by the idea of the suffering Christ. I think that's mistaken. If you look at the oldest known narrative in human history, it's Gilgamesh. And the Epic of Gilgamesh is basically the story of a narcissistic protagonist who learns compassion in the world through a love for a friendship. And there's so many other ancient histories, belief systems that incorporate compassion as a central tenet. Lately in America, I've heard a lot of people on the Christian right trying to act as if they corner the market on compassion, and that it doesn't exist in ways and ideologies outside of Christianity. And I just think that you're taking quite a, quite an arrogant leap in suggesting that the idea of compassion is inherent and was really brought to the Western world through Christianity.
All right, Dinesh.
Well, Western civilization was certainly not built on Gilgamesh, nor was it built on Ashoka, nor was it built on ancient Buddhism. You find teachings of compassion in those places, I agree, but they had nothing to do with Western civilization enshrining compassion as one of its key values. One second, finish my thought. And even though those values were there in embryonic form elsewhere, they became quickly extinguished. For example, Buddhism became abolished in the land of its birth, namely India. It had to travel into Asia, East Asia, to find a home. And of course, Gilgamesh is long forgotten in the cultures that now inhabit that territory. Here's the point I want to make, and this settles the issue in my opinion. If there was tomorrow a huge famine in Rwanda, what would happen? Right away, the Western cultures in the world there would be outrage, and there would be an immediate desire to help. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, bags of food, airlifts, checks, tsunami relief funds, and so on would begin. Now, there are other rich cultures in the world. There are oil-rich countries in the Middle East. What would they do? Very little. There's a lot of wealth now in China and India. What would happen? Those countries may help, but maybe not to the same degree. Here's the point I want to get at. The cultural value. And this is, by the way, shared by believers and atheists. I expect even Michael Shermer's check might be bigger than that of, let's say, a Chinese doctor. Here's an equivalent in Beijing. The point I'm getting at here is that Western culture has formed us in a certain way. Now, Shermer is just saying, well, that's the way we are, but no. All you have to have is a sense of history to see that's not the way we are. That's not man as he was naturally given. These are culturally shaped values. Christianity, I may not have invented them, but it certainly established them in Western civilization for what they are, along with classical Athens and Rome. So those are the roots of Christianity, and all I'm saying is we should give some acknowledgement to that.
Now, since you said what I would say, maybe I will say what I would say. I think if we take an even bigger, longer picture, the long view, that for 99.9% of our history was spent in these small groups of hunter-gatherers, a couple of dozen to a couple of hundred people, where everybody knows one another or related to one another. And in that sense, conflicts and moral conflicts and resolutions all come about through these informal means. About 10,000 years ago, this began to change as these small bands and tribes began to coalesce into these larger chiefdoms and states. Once you get up into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, those informal rules don't work anymore. You need some system to codify the rules by which we're all going to get along with people that you don't even know, you have no relationship to, and those two institutions were government and religion. And I think what we've seen in human history is a long struggle to figure out what's the right configuration. So we have a whole variety of these different religions and governments, some of which work much better than others. And I think what we're seeing here is a sort of a filtering down to a liberal democracy, a Christianity that's much better than Islam, and so on and so forth. And we're refining those, and that's the long path by which we've all taken to get here.
All right, let's leave it there. Let's thank Michael Shermer, Dinesh D'Souza.
Good job. That was great. Thank you.